All right, thank you, Deirdre. And thanks to, oh yeah, we have a nice map of the US for background. And thanks to Emily Nelson here, who's the technology expert. She knows more about the technology even than I do. And thanks to Metal Arts for the studio here. Partly because this is Black History Month, February, there are, right this week, there are a couple of special series on. Dennis Kirkland alerted me to this one. It's on NPR, titled The Journey to Jazz and Human Rights. It's a history of jazz, blues, and the roots of Black music in America. And it's extraordinarily good. It's blending together the Black music and the history of the Black struggle blended together. It's really extraordinary. It's on tonight at 7 o'clock.
You said NPR, did you mean PBS?
No, actually, can I interrupt for a second, Bill? It's KN, Bill, can you hear me? This is Dennis. It's KNKX.
Yeah, KNKX.
Which is, the Western Washington Public Radio, one of the public radio stations, but it's not NPR, it's KNKX. And you can live stream it on your computer, but you have to go onto KNKX website and then choose, online and then live stream.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. That's parts 3 and 4 are on tonight and tomorrow night. And then a second one is also on tonight, The Black Church. It's a 400-year history of Black music in the Black Church. And that is on PBS. Okay, also, I have a correction to make from last week. We're talking about rap music, and I mentioned that the rap superstar, Mac Phipps, had started his own Black recording company. That was wrong. It was his friend, Mac Phipps's friend, Master P, who was also a superstar and a very astute business manager. He started his own Black recording studio. So it was P rather than Mac Phipps. A quick review of what we did last time. We reviewed a lot of Black music, starting with rock and roll in the late 40s, early 1950s. Rock and roll. Then we did some jazz, gospel music, Mahalia Jackson, a lot of individual Black composers like Duke Ellington, Ray Charles, Jose Feliciano, Jimi Hendrix, Elvis. Then we finished up with some Afro-Cuban, some extraordinary links between West Africa, between Sierra Leone and West Africa and Havana, Cuba, with the stilt dancers. And a couple of other connections very recent connections between the Africans in Sierra Leone and Liberia with Cuba. As a summary, I'm going to read about 3 lines, which we started with a couple of classes ago, summarizing the Black contribution to American music. American music is the most listened to music in the world, by far. And it's a combination. The melody and harmony from our music comes from Europe, but the rhythm of our music comes from Africa. So the blending of these two, the European melody, harmony, with African rhythm, has created some of the richest music in the world. And it could only have happened here in America. So we are surrounded, as we've gotten the picture, we are surrounded by music, nearly all of which is sprung from African rhythms, contribution of the African Americans, which is still fermenting and going on today. So I want to also add a final note, and we're going to the pictures, the slides, Emily, for this. It's a final note on African American music. For 250 years, for 2.5 centuries, this country was a slave country. For 250 years, actually 246, the slaves were working 15 hours a day, 14 hours in the winter time. Totally exhausting work, backbreaking labor. And they knew that there was no hope of freedom. No hope of freedom during their lifetimes. No hope of freedom for their children, for their grandchildren. And it seemed as if there was nothing to live for. But my point is that music for the African slaves, African Americans, was a survival mechanism. Music was a survival mechanism. It seemed to have nothing to live for, but the field songs here in the cotton fields, work songs, and church songs, all to the rhythm, the African sophisticated rhythms, as you see in the gospel singers here, the church music, field songs, all of that music and rhythm created a bond and bound the African Americans together. So it was a survival technique. So if it worked for their music, well, I guess bottom line, music is the one thing that saved African Americans. Okay, today we're going to do 2 different topics. In Wilmington, North Carolina, in 1898, 123 years ago, it was not a race riot as historians have made it sound, but it was an actual coup d'etat. The government of the city of Wilmington, now you're looking at a map of the Carolinas. In North Carolina, the green state there, you go down to the very bottom, it's a harbor city, a port city on the Atlantic. Wilmington was the largest city in North Carolina at the time, 1898, when this extraordinary event happened. It was an actual coup d'etat, and there were so many similarities to what happened here last month on January the 6th. So many similarities that I thought I decided to include this. And you will be watching, have your antennae out for the similarities between this, it was a forceful takeover of the government, a slaughter of many blacks in Wilmington, and an overthrow of the government that succeeded, a forceful takeover of the city government, and as it turned out, the entire state government of North Carolina. Now, the 2 events, the coup d'etat, the riot in Wilmington, by the way, not to be confused with Wilmington, Delaware, that's the hometown of President Joe Biden. Same name, named for the same person, Prime Minister of Britain in the early 1700s. But the similarity with the Wilmington coup and the attempted overthrow of the American government, the storming of the Capitol, have so many parallels here, and they are on your outline. Here are some of the similarities. Each of the 2 events was organized and planned. Each of the 2 events was an effort to steal an election and disenfranchise voters. Both of the two events were driven by white supremacists. And, very important point, each of the two events in Wilmington and Washington, the Capitol building in Washington, they required the help of the media to be successful. So what happened in Wilmington? The legitimate government of the city, Wilmington, the largest city in the state at that time. By the way, Raleigh, the capital, is north of there, north central part of the state. The legitimately elected government, city government of Wilmington, was biracial. That is to say, there were both whites and blacks serving on the city council and in other offices, important offices. And the white supremacists in the city, actually in the state, North Carolina, decided, and they were able to overthrow the city government, overthrow the biracial government. And historically, the event was largely covered up until 3 years ago, till the year 2017. So this is another story that you did not learn in school. So what happened in Wilmington? Well, in 1898, a gentleman named Charles B. Aycock decided he wanted to become governor of North Carolina. So he formed a plan to overthrow the legitimate government of the city of Wilmington. Wilmington, by the way, had a black majority population. There was a thriving black middle class, and the blacks of the community had a higher literacy rate than the whites. The blacks ran some of the most successful businesses, like restaurants, tailors, shoemakers, furniture makers, jewelers, and they held public office, as I mentioned. Well, that was very disturbing to many of the white supremacists of the state. So they were determined to get back into power. So Aycock joined with two other gentlemen, the Democratic Party's campaign manager. By the way, at that time, the white supremacy party was the Democratic Party, and that shifted totally in the 1960s. So I'm going to just call them the white supremacist party. And also the editor, Josephus Daniels, was the editor of Raleigh's News and Observer. It was, and that newspaper, it was the most influential newspaper in the state, of course, published up in Raleigh, but its news stories were spread out through the entire state. The editor called the Raleigh News and Observer, quote, the militant voice of white supremacy. No attempt to conceal that. So the editor published, this started weeks, actually months before the election of 1898. So the editor started publishing articles, editorials, speeches, letters to the editor, all telling lies about black criminal acts, lies about sexual assaults against white women. And this was repeated over and over. And the articles, we have the wrong picture. The next picture is going to be, The reason I have this picture, and this is one of the most recent pictures of the storming, we're going to switch, Emily, very soon, of the storming of the Capitol building. This is Vice President Pence being hurried, rushed out just seconds before the mob stormed in, just to show parallels between the two. Okay, the next picture. Yeah, just paralleling the storming of the Capitol with what's happening in Wilmington. So in Wilmington here, you see, this is the black newspaper office that was burned. Many blacks were killed in the streets. But this, now here's an aerial photo of Wilmington, North Carolina. This is the Cape Fear River. By the way, it's very timely. If you follow the news yesterday, there was a hurricane that wrecked, 3 people were killed, and it was a totally devastating in Brunswick County, which is on the left side of the Cape Fear River. So Wilmington was in the national news yesterday. Now the editor of the News and Observer, Daniels, hired a cartoonist. This is a small picture, but it shows Wilmington after the riot. You see there's a large section of the downtown area here is totally devastated. It's in rubble. Oops. Now look at this political cartoon. Daniels hired a cartoonist to do a series of cartoons. This is amazing. Here you have the well-dressed black foot and shoe stepping on the white man, crushing the white man. This was on the front page, spread across the state of North Carolina. A little hard to read the cut line. By the way, at that time, I mentioned the media was essential in both storming of the Capitol last month in Washington, D.C., and the successful coup to take over the government of Wilmington. At that time, the newspaper was the medium of dispensing ideas and influencing people's opinions. And the newspapers were very effective. And during the campaign, the red shirts, it was a militia arm of the party. The red shirts came into Wilmington and intimidated black citizens from participating in politics and even to discourage them from voting. Now there was a black newspaper in Wilmington, the Black Daily. The editor was a black man named Alexander Manley, and he decided to fight back. But here is another political cartoon that ran on the front page. The club, you see the black man there, if you see the feathers hat says Negro Rule. And the arm with the club is the honest white man. And the club is called the ballot. Imagine regular political cartoons like this on the front page of the most influential paper in the state, and it went on and on, week after week, until the election. The black editor of the Daily Record finally decided to fight back. So Manley decided to tell the truth in a bold editorial. Namely, some white women fell in love with black men. Now, if an affair like this was discovered, and it was frequently, immediately it was labeled as rape, and also immediately there was a brutal lynching of the accused black man. The white supremacist really did not want to hear this message. Now here's a picture of the newspaper building that was burned. So here's the headline: a white supremacist coup succeeded in 1898 in North Carolina, led by lying politicians and racist newspapers that amplified their lies. And you see the only black newspaper, the only black daily in the country here is smoking from having been burned. And you see the mob of white men. Now, I'm very sorry this picture is so small, but what it is, it's the red shirts, the militia that was sent in huge numbers to attack, and they murdered countless number of blacks in the streets. We still don't know how many blacks were killed, but we do know that at least 1,400 blacks fled for their lives, many of whom never came back again. So, by lies and intimidation, the white supremacists did regain their power. And as a result, there was a constitutional amendment passed which disenfranchised black citizens of North Carolina. A constitutional amendment stated that black citizens of North Carolina could not vote by law, by state law. Repeat, black citizens of North Carolina could not vote. And that held for many years, for many decades, at least until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So that's over 6 decades, blacks in North Carolina simply could not vote by state law. That's hard to believe. Now the parallels, I'm sure you've been making some parallels in your own mind. The parallels with Trump, for 4 years, the white right-wing news media spread lies, flagrant lies, repeated over and over for 4 years, just as the white supremacy newspaper did in North Carolina. Here, the social media, inspired by Trump, social media companies offered platforms that turned these lies into mass delusion that radicalized a large portion of the Republican base. So especially after the election, for 2 months, the big lie was repeated over and over. I won the election, Trump won the election, and it was a stolen election. And the result of that being repeated day after day was that many Republicans started to believe it, and still do, a disturbing number of Republicans. Okay, now that finishes our segment on Wilmington, North Carolina. What happened, it was a successful coup, planned, organized, carried out, and it was successful in overthrowing the legitimate biracial government of the city of Wilmington, and then the entire state, because the Aycock did become the governor of North Carolina, and he promoted the amendment to the Constitution where the stating that blacks could not vote. Now we're moving on. Oh, this is a historical marker at Wilmington today, and this was put up just 3 years ago in 2017. Finally, the city leaders of Wilmington were decided to confess their history, and this historical marker shows the new attitude, which is encouraging, but it took a while. I should mention that many of you know Jim Kistner. Jim and Doris Kistner left the Methow about 4.5 years ago, and they moved to Wilmington, North Carolina. And Jim, of course, has always been an activist, very articulate. He was an English teacher at Liberty Bell High School for many years, and in my judgment, certainly one of the best teachers in history of the Methow. Anyway, living in Wilmington, he would go to the city council meetings, and the NAACP was lobbying the city council to correct in the public schools. The black students in the public schools were being outrageously shorted of finances and help, food, teaching. And Jim attended city council meetings, and he's very articulate. He was lobbying, embarrassing the members of the city council. Anyway, they finally came around 3 years ago and have admitted what the people of Wilmington had done in the coup. Okay, now changing subjects. The topic is sugar plantations in the American South. Sugar plantations in the American South. Now, as I mentioned, as you know, this was a slave country for 246 years. We lived in a slave country for more years than this has been the United States. Yet, we know very little about the lives of the slaves during those 2.5 centuries in the South. When we think of plantations in the Old South, I think most of us think of a cotton plantation. But today we're going to visit sugar plantation, and because there was more than just cotton plantations. But I think we know even less about the sugar plantations in the South. There was one state. What state of the Union produced most sugar cane in the Old South, and still does today, actually? What state has earned most profits from sugar? Louisiana. The climate and soil is ideal in Louisiana. So here's a question. What did it feel like to be a slave on a sugar plantation? Now here's a chance for you to really get the taste of history. You need to put yourself, as much as you can, back in the place, in the shoes or bare feet of people. And we're going to try to get a feeling of what it was like to be a slave in Louisiana on a sugar plantation. By the way, Isabel Wilkerson is an extraordinarily skillful writer. She has pointed out in the book Caste, which many of you are reading or have read, she points out that the term plantation is just a polite word. The truth is that the so-called plantations were slave labor camps. Slave labor camps, politely called plantations, where the people, as I mentioned, worked 15 hours a day. Their body were totally owned by another person. They had no freedoms whatsoever. And now this map shows the United States in the 1780s. The original 13 colonies and 13 states were all along the seaboard, Atlantic seaboard. And want to use this map to show that there were other plantations besides just cotton. For a couple of centuries, tobacco was the principal cash crop. Of course, it began in Virginia. You can see the Chesapeake, you can see Virginia on the map. So tobacco farms and plantations became the principal plantation. Then secondly, go down to South Carolina, rice plantations. Rice became a very successful crop. And it's an interesting fact, and I typed this into your outline. The English colonists in the South, the English colonists had no idea how to grow rice, how to farm rice. There's a lot of skill required, a lot of experience. And how did the Southern planters learn how to grow rice? From the slaves. The slaves from West Africa, for hundreds of years on the coast, Liberia, Sierra Leone, all the way around to the Slave Coast, the Gold Coast, the climate was ideal for growing rice. So when the slaves were brought to the New World, they had had experience in centuries of farming rice. So the African slaves taught the white settlers in South Carolina, first of all, how you farm rice. That is extraordinary irony, isn't it? So rice became very profitable, especially in South Carolina, and also the bordering Georgia and the Carolina and North Carolina. Then sugar was the third very profitable crop principally along the lower Mississippi River in Louisiana and up into Mississippi. And that's where we're going today. And then fourthly, cotton plantations. You can see in this map, the cotton belt has not even been settled yet, from Georgia straight across Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and East Texas. Cotton became hugely profitable. But my point is we have tobacco plantations, rice plantations, cotton plantations, and sugar plantations. But sugar is different. Farming sugar was different from all of the others. To grow sugar was much more demanding. It required a huge amount of labor, physical labor, that is slaves, more than the other plantations. Sugar plantation required capital, a lot of capital, because of the equipment, the machinery, the lot of expenses. So a poor settler could not easily start up a sugar plantation. Sugar plantation required expertise, a lot of skill and expertise. The plantation owner, to their credit, to their positive credit, the plantation owners had to learn how to grow sugar. It took a long time, a couple of generations to really, at least, to learn it. But a lot of ambitious white pioneers. And of course, the plantation manager and the foreman of the slaves, they all had to learn a lot of technique and skill. And we're going to find out why. So in a sugar plantation, let's see. Now this second map shows the Cotton Belt when it's settled by 1821, including Louisiana with its, Louisiana did grow cotton, but sugar produced more profit than even cotton in Louisiana. Now here we have we're looking at a tobacco field. This was common up in Virginia, especially for more than a century. Here we have a rice plantation down in South Carolina. Here is a sugar plantation. This is in Cuba. I don't have a good picture of Louisiana. And finally, the cotton fields. And Louisiana, especially along the Mississippi. You see New Orleans down at the mouth, and you go up the Mississippi River, and then the border with the state of Mississippi and Louisiana. This is all very rich soil for sugar plantations. So the sugar plantation, here is a historic drawing of planting sugar cane. You'll see the slaves up on the side hill there working with hoes. By the way, the plantation owners learned that you have to, all this cultivating was done by hand, by slaves. And a trick that the slaves learned early was, if they were able to break the handle of the hoe, they had to walk back to the base, the manor house, and get a new hoe. So these are all strong-handled hoes. So the slaves are cultivating by hand. This kind of work went on 15 hours a day. It's back-breaking labor. And the ones on the lower part here are planting sugarcane. So for a sugar plantation requires a huge amount of work. Planting here, cultivating the soil first, harvesting the cane, protecting the cane fields from rats, and sugarcane, generally you cannot plant it upright. In this picture, it's an exception. Let's go back one. Because with the prevailing winds, if you plant sugar straight up and down, it doesn't take much wind to blow them over and damage most of the crop. So sugarcane has to be planted horizontally. You lie it on its side and plant the base of it, and from there it'll grow up stronger and upright. Which reminds me, here in the Methow, a lot of gardeners, some of gardeners, I'm thinking of some master gardeners, know how to plant tomatoes more successfully, the same way that you plant sugarcane. When you take your tomatoes out of the greenhouse, let's say they're about a foot tall, instead of planting it upright, if you lay the tomato plant on its side, like the bottom 5 inches about, cover all of that with dirt and leave the other half a foot or more open to the air and the sun. And that 5 inches below the dirt will send out many, many more roots than just the bottom of the plant. And so it gets much more solidly rooted, makes a stronger, more fertile tomato plant, and it will, of its own, rise up and to seek the sun. And the sugar cane, now here's this amazing historic drawing, shows a cane crushing mill, a grinding mill. So sugarcane has to be cut at exactly the right moment of ripeness. It's very delicate. Sugarcane juice spoils very quickly, spoils in 1 or 2 days after it's cut. So after about 24 hours, that precious cane juice can spoil, and then it's useless. So the cane juice has to be extracted as fast as possible. That means all the slaves are working really fast, really hard, and really fast. And the owner, by the way, to have a sugar plantation, the owner has to have his own grinding mill right on the site near the cane fields. So if you look at this picture, exceptional drawing, you see the grinding gears. The slaves are feeding the cane in. You have 3 cylindrical upright grinding gears, and that allows for 2 different places where the cane is pushed into the grinder. It squeezes all the juice out. I mean, all the juice. It's amazingly effective. And then the juice, well, first of all, and also you see that in this case, oxen are going around and around and turning the gears of the grinding mill. So it can be powered by oxen or horses or men, even slaves. Now here's a picture of myself at a cane field. You can see the cane is, I'm about 6 feet tall. The cane is 10 or 11 feet tall. And here's a close-up look. If you haven't seen sugarcane grow, it's a long ways to anywhere we grow sugarcane. That's my hand. But you see the stalk of sugarcane if you haven't seen it before. And as I say, oxen, horses, or slaves. Now there's one place in Cuba. This is a manor house you've seen before. It's kept as like a museum of the sugar mills. So this is the manor house, and right beside the manor house is a sugar mill. Now this is a terrific drawing of a sugar mill. It's a stone windmill, and most of the plantations had a stone windmill like this, and the windmill is grinding, it's powering the crushing gears down inside. You see the oxen are pulling up carts of sugarcane to the grinding mill, and look at that building beside it, behind it. That is the boiler house, the boiler house. Now here, as I mentioned, it can be, some of the mills were powered by humans. Now here, this, you guessed it, it's Emmett Cade who's pushing a grinding mill at this plantation in Cuba. Now the boiler house, this process is very complicated. The purpose of the boiler house there is to produce sugar that has been crystallized. It's a most complicated process, the most complicated of all, and it's very delicate. By the way, before we leave the grinding mill, should mention it was extremely dangerous work. The slaves operating it needed to be highly skillful and were exhausted, fatigued and exhausted, obviously, working so many hours a day. The mill feeder, he could easily get a piece of his clothing or hand caught in the grinding mill. And there was always an axe right at hand to chop off the hand or limb of the feeder if it was possible to save his life. And here's a quote from a former slave, a Louisiana slave, who has witnessed this. Quote, "If the mill feeder be catched by his finger, his whole body is drawn in and he is squeezed to pieces." So that is, it happens frequently in the grinding mill. So it's very dangerous work. And there's another thing that's dangerous. And now the process is a series of huge copper kettles over a furnace. Now here we're going to visit, this is a picture of Grenada, the island of Grenada in the West Indies. It's the southern tip of the Windward Islands, Leeward Islands. A lot of these islands in the West Indies still do grow sugarcane. The climate is ideal. And Diana and I spent a month on this island, and we were hiking back in the tropical forest and came across this extraordinary water wheel. It's probably 30 feet tall. We just found it by accident, overgrown. And here's the second picture is this stone building. And we say, oh my God, here is an old sugar mill that's abandoned. We hit the jackpot. It looked abandoned, but it was actually still in operation. Now here's Diana holding a long-handled ladle, and you see it's a long row of big kettles, copper kettles, where the cane juice was boiled. And of course, it had to be gotten into the boiling kettles here very rapidly. So then the first kettle here, and of course there's a furnace underneath, so it's extremely hot in the boiler house. So the first kettle, and they get smaller and smaller. And the first kettle, the impurities are skimmed off the top, and then the boiling sugar juice is ladled into the next larger kettle. This was extraordinarily luck that we found this still operating sugar mill just by accident. So it's boiled in the second pot, hotter, and then ladled into a third kettle, and finally a final kettle. They got smaller and smaller and hotter and hotter. By this time, by the final kettle, the sugar is thick. And quicklime is added to aid the granulation process. Now, at exactly the right moment, the boiling sugar is struck. That is to say, it's ladled into a cooling cistern. Now, at this moment, the sugar juice, it's gooey, it's a gooey gob by this time. It begins to crystallize. And of course, and the final result is granulated sugar. Now the boiler, as I mentioned, is a very skilled position and hazardous. And sometimes the boiler house gets so hot that water has to be thrown onto the roof so that the shingles don't catch fire. It was that hot in the boiler room. Another hazard, and this is one of the worst hazards working. I hope you've been putting yourself into the place of slaves doing the work here on this sugar plantation. So in addition to enduring the horrible heat and the stench, the workers were often burned by the sugar. Here's what happens. The kettle, especially the kettle of cane juice at the smallest and hottest, becomes so thick, becomes a gooey gob, and it's spurting out small gobs of this molten sugar. And if a gob of that sugar lands on any part of his body, if the worker got any part of his hand or arm down into the sugar, or if a gob boils out and lands on his arm, it sticks like glue. There is no way to get that off your body. And what it does, it burns all the way through your flesh, right down to the bone. It's at that point, it is hard to save a man's life, to save his limb and his life. So by that time, the worker dies from his flesh being eaten away by that molten sugar. So that is now here's a political cartoon. This shows the cauldron of sugar and a slave that has fallen into it. But this is a political cartoon in a London newspaper, it says in 1791. What it is, it's an anti-sugar political cartoon. By this time, the people of England, Britain, have learned how hazardous and how brutal the work is on a sugar plantation. And this is part of a movement to humanize or shut down the worst abuses of the sugar mills and the sugar plantations. Okay, that wraps it up. That's what goes on at a sugar plantation. And this final picture shows a sugar harvest in Louisiana. So next week, we're going to visit one sugar plantation in Louisiana on the Mississippi River, this one right here. So if you have any questions or comments, I hope you've been typing them in. So
Thank you, Bill. That was amazing. We always learn so much, and I know you spend a lot of time doing all that research, so we really appreciate